The crack of laughter carried through the magnolia trees like a pistol shot. By morning, that same laughter would echo through an empty house consumed by fire. Power always thinks it's untouchable. That's why this story matters. On a warm evening in May of 1842, the plantation house at Belle Chene glowed with lamplight and arrogance. Cicadas screamed from the swamps. The air smelled of bourbon and tobacco smoke, and the linen tablecloth beneath the candles felt smooth as polished bone. At the head of the table sat Master Alistair Vane, a man whose fortune was measured in acres and human lives. Across from him, silent and steady, stood the woman he called Mira. She was 28, born on that land, raised to anticipate his every whim before he spoke it. Her face betrayed nothing, but her mind was a ledger of every cruelty she had witnessed. That night, she would begin balancing it. "The wager," Vane declared, swirling his glass, "is simple. You believe yourself clever, girl? Outsmart me and you'll have your freedom. Fail, and you'll serve in chains till you die." The other guests laughed, planters, judges, men fat on power, as if he'd announced a parlor trick. But Mira's eyes didn't flicker. "Then let it be written," she said quietly, "so the Lord remembers who promised." A servant in livery fetched a quill. The document was signed, sealed with wax, and witnessed by 6 men who thought the game would amuse them. They didn't know they were signing away their own safety. She would win with silence and smoke. Before we go deeper into this story, where pride and punishment trade places, tell me, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments below. And if tales like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because this one's been buried in plantation records for nearly 2 centuries. The wager was public, whispered across Adams County by morning. Some said Vane had grown bored. Others that he wanted to prove intellect belonged only to the free. For Mira, it was the first legal sentence she'd ever seen written with her name. Her plan began the moment the ink dried. In the kitchen that night, the sound of knives on wood kept time with her thoughts. The smell of boiling molasses filled the room, thick and cloying. Beneath the table, her fingers traced invisible patterns, columns and sums. She'd spent years learning numbers while pretending to polish silver, memorizing every line of Vane's ledgers when he left them open after brandy. Now she knew the one truth he didn't. His empire bled debt. 2,000 acres mortgaged twice over, tobacco harvests pledged before they were planted. He was drowning, and he didn't know she held the rope. The first move came quietly. Mira approached the overseer's clerk, a nervous young man named Ezra who fancied himself kind. She told him she could read, swore she wouldn't tell. In return, she asked him to show her the account books, said she only wanted to see how the world worked. Within weeks, she was copying every number by candlelight into scraps hidden in flour sacks. Each sum was a secret weapon. Vane noticed none of it. He spent his days hunting, his nights gambling, his pride too bloated to imagine danger from below. The only one who sensed something shifting was old Mrs. Dalrymple, the housekeeper, who once whispered, "That girl's eyes are too still. Storms build in still water." The storm was coming. One night in late June, Vane called for Mira again. "Have you found a way to outwit me yet?" he taunted, half drunk. "Or do you plan to wait until I die?" She smiled faintly. A wise man doesn't reveal his strategy before the game ends. He roared with laughter. "You've spirit, I'll grant you that. But spirit can't read the law." That was his mistake, assuming she couldn't. Because that same week, Mira had persuaded Ezra to let her handle correspondence. She sealed letters with wax, filed receipts, and quietly replaced one deed with another. By the time the sheriff received notice of sale, 3 parcels of Vane's land had already been transferred to a new owner, a name no one recognized, Amira Cole. Her mother's name, her true name. When Vane learned of the missing documents, he assumed clerical error. He never thought a woman in his own kitchen had rewritten his wealth. But the walls had ears and tongues. Among the enslaved, whispers spread. She's playing the master's game and winning. Hope is a dangerous contagion. Every night, Mira listened through the parlor door as Vane cursed accountants and bankers. His fury smelled of sweat and rum. He ordered locks changed, records burned, loyalty tested. Yet each measure tightened the snare she'd laid. Then came the night of the thunderstorm, July 10th, 1842. Lightning carved the sky over Belchane like a knife through cloth. In the stables, horses reared against the thunder, while rain drummed the roof like judgment. Mira used the chaos to slip into Vane's study. She moved by memory, 3 steps from the hearth, 1 loose floorboard, the iron box beneath. Inside, deeds, bank drafts, insurance papers, the spine of his fortune. She took them all, wrapped them in oilcloth, and vanished into the dark. By dawn, a messenger would find the first document filed at the county courthouse, legally executed, witnessed, sealed, proof that ownership had changed hands days earlier. The forgeries were perfect. She'd had months to practice. In the gray before sunrise, Mira stood by the riverbank watching the storm move east. Smoke from a single lantern wove through the mist. Ezra stood beside her, pale and shaking. "You'll be killed for this," he whispered. "Maybe," she said, "but he'll lose everything first." When the rooster crowed, the big house still slept, unaware its wealth was already gone. The wager had been met. But vengeance, once awakened, rarely stops at victory. Because Alistair Vane would discover the theft before sunset, and when he did, blood and fire would follow. By nightfall, Belchane would burn. The first scream came from the study. By breakfast, the entire house was awake, because power, once wounded, bleeds chaos. At 7:30 that morning, the smell of scorched coffee mixed with rain-soaked ash drifted through the corridors of Belchane. Papers littered the parlor floor like fallen birds. Alistair Vane stood barefoot amid them, a pistol in one hand, a half-burned deed in the other. He had discovered the theft. His voice cut through the house, hoarse, furious, disbelieving. "Who touched my box?" Servants froze where they stood. Even the hounds outside went silent. Mira, carrying a breakfast tray, paused at the doorway. Her face was calm, but her pulse thundered. "What box, master?" she asked softly. Vane hurled the pistol against the wall. "Don't you play dumb with me, girl. You think I don't know your hand in this?" He pointed at the papers on the floor. Forgeries, every one of them, though he couldn't yet prove it. Land deeds signed to ghosts, bank drafts missing. Someone's made me a fool. Mira lowered her eyes. "Perhaps your own lawyers?" That answer struck him like a slap. "You mocking me?" he roared. But she only bowed. That was the moment he began to doubt his own mind. The rot had started. Outside, thunder grumbled low across the fields. Mud sucked at the boots of field hands trudging through cotton rows still heavy from last night's rain. Word spread in whispers. The master's gone mad. He's shouting at shadows. In town, rumors grew like weeds. The Belshane holdings were unraveling fast. At the county courthouse, clerks double-checked signatures that looked too perfect, dates that lined up too neatly. No one wanted to accuse a man as powerful as Alistair Vane of negligence. But behind closed doors, bankers whispered, "He's losing his grip." Mira's plan had worked better than she dared hope. In the smokehouse behind the kitchen, she and Ezra met by lamplight. The air smelled of salt and hickory. Her fingers were blackened from soot. She'd just burned the last of the drafts to eliminate any evidence of forgery. "It's done," she said. "By morning, half the county will know he's ruined." Ezra's voice trembled. "He'll hang us if he finds out." "He'll never know which way to turn," she replied. "He'll blame everyone before he blames himself." Through the slats of the smokehouse wall, they could see lightning flicker far to the east. Another storm coming. The storm never really left Belshane. That afternoon, Vane summoned the entire household to the veranda. The floorboards creaked beneath 30 barefoot workers lined in rows. The air buzzed with mosquitoes and fear. Vane paced, his face crimson, his white shirt clinging with sweat. "Someone here," he growled, "has betrayed me, stolen what's mine. You think you can shame me before this county? You think you can ruin Alistair Vane?" He stopped before Mira. "Was it you?" She met his gaze. "If I had power enough to ruin you, Master, I'd already be free." The words cut clean through the crowd. A murmur rippled, quickly silenced by Vane's glare. He turned to his overseer Gideon Pike, a man with a scar running from ear to jaw. "Lock the quarters. Nobody leaves the property." And then quieter. "Find me proof." By sunset, the plantation had turned into a prison. The overseer's men patrolled with lanterns. Dogs howled. The air reeked of panic. From the quarters, Mira watched fireflies flicker in the grass and thought of her mother. Sold to Louisiana when Mira was 10. "You told me knowledge is sharper than any blade," she whispered into the dark. "Tonight I'll prove it." She didn't sleep. Instead, she prepared the second phase. While Vane obsessed over finding the thief, his creditors moved faster. At dawn, 2 riders from Natchez arrived with court orders. They spoke in clipped tones, the scent of rain and horse sweat clinging to their coats. "Sir, your accounts are frozen," one said. "The deeds are in dispute. Until proven otherwise, Belshane is not yours to operate." Vane's face turned the color of old parchment. "Impossible. I'm Alistair Vane." The rider shrugged. "The law doesn't care what name you call yourself." In the doorway behind him, Mira stood holding his coffee. She'd sweetened it with nothing but sugar, but still, he glared as if tasting poison. The empire was collapsing. By mid-morning, the sheriff arrived. A portly man with the patience of a vulture, he walked the halls with a notepad and a squint. "We'll need to inspect your safes, sir." Vane's voice cracked. "You'll do no such—" "Law's the law." Mira trailed behind, silent shadow to his fury. The sheriff opened drawers, lifted ledgers, studied seals. "Remarkable forgeries," he muttered. "Whoever did this knew their letters." He turned toward Mira as if testing her face. She gave him nothing but polite stillness. When they left, Vane collapsed into his chair, head in hands. "You think they'll take everything?" he rasped. "I think," Mira said quietly, "they already have." For a long moment, the only sound was the grandfather clock marking seconds like hammer blows. Then Vane whispered, "You think you're clever?" Mira inclined her head. "You were the one who said so." That night, the overseer found Ezra hiding behind the stables, dragged him before Vane, demanded answers. Mira watched from the shadows as Ezra shook, eyes wide, lips trembling around half-truths. "I didn't mean to," he stammered. "She said it would just scare you." Vane's hand struck him, so hard the sound cracked through the room. "Who?" Ezra hesitated 1 second too long. "Mira." The word dropped like a spark into oil. Within minutes, they were storming through the quarters. Lamps swung, dogs barked, orders shouted. "Find her!" Vane bellowed. "Bring her to me!" But the cabin was empty, bed neatly made, as if she'd only stepped out for water. The small window stood open to the night. In the distance, the bell tower tolled 9 times. From the swamp beyond the cane fields, a single light flickered. A lantern moving fast toward the river. Freedom tastes like smoke and rain. What would you have done standing in that mud, hearing the dogs, knowing the cost of disobedience? Would you have run, or stayed and watched the house that owned you eat itself alive? Because what happened next wasn't escape. It was judgment. Vane rowed hard toward the river, shouting her name into the storm. Lightning tore the sky in half, illuminating cypress trees and the gleam of water below. He saw movement ahead, a figure in the reeds, and spurred his horse forward. "Mira," he shouted, "you think you can steal from me and live?" The figure turned. For one heartbeat, their eyes met across the distance. Then she dropped the lantern into the tall grass. Fire bloomed. The cane field erupted like dry paper catching flame. The wind carried it straight toward the house. Within minutes, the night glowed orange, smoke curling into thunderclouds. Servants poured from the quarters, some screaming, others watching in stunned silence. Old Mrs. Dalrymple crossed herself and whispered, "Lord have mercy." No one tried to stop the blaze. Not the overseer, not the field hands, not even the housemaids who'd spent their lives scrubbing those floors. They stood together, faces lit by firelight, and watched the great white house crumble. The master's wager was over. At the riverbank, Mira waded into the black water, clutching her bundle of papers wrapped in oilcloth. Behind her, Belchen's reflection rippled, a burning crown sinking beneath smoke. She didn't look back. By dawn, Alistair Vane's estate was ash. The man himself lay unconscious near the collapsed veranda, his fortune scattered to the wind, his name soon to become a cautionary whisper. And somewhere downriver, a woman with nothing but forged deeds and unbreakable patience drifted toward a future that didn't yet have a name. But vengeance, like debt, always demands repayment. Because the fire may have freed Mira, yet by sunset, the law would be hunting her. The chase had begun. The air still smelled of smoke when the hounds began to bay. By noon, the ruins of Belchen were crawling with men on horseback, because no one in power lets ruin go unpunished. The fire had devoured nearly everything: house, ledgers, stables, half the cane fields. Only the brick chimneys stood upright, skeletal against the pale August sky. Alistair Vane, bruised and half-mad, watched as ash drifted through the air like gray snow. His voice was raw from shouting her name through the night. "She's out there," he rasped to Sheriff Cole, who had arrived from Natchez with 4 deputies. "The slave woman. She stole my land, burned my house. I want her found before sundown." Sheriff Cole, a man with a calm cruelty about him, tipped his hat. "We'll find her, sir. Smoke's still fresh. Dogs can track." The hounds whined and pawed at the scorched earth, noses twitching toward the woods. One found a scent, faint, sweet, mixed with river mud. The men spurred their horses, the sound of hooves thudding through the blackened fields. Mira had planned for this. At dawn, she'd followed the bayou north, moving waist-deep through the water to break the dog's trail. The swamp was thick with rot and buzzing life. The air smelled of wet moss and bloodroot, her dress clinging like second skin. Each step sank into muck that pulled at her ankles. But she wasn't alone. Ahead waited a small skiff and a woman named Cora, a free black trader who'd ferried salt and secrets up and down the Mississippi for years. Cora's voice was low as thunder when she spoke. "You sure about this, girl? Once we push off, there ain't no turning back." Mira looked toward the east, where the orange glow of the burning estate painted the sky. "There's nothing left to turn back to." They pushed into the current. The river carried them like a whispered promise. Freedom rides with the current. Back at Belchane, Vane's men searched every inch of ash for signs. Footprints, scraps of cloth, anything. One deputy found something half buried near the old bell tower, a silver locket shaped like a teardrop. Inside was a curl of hair tied with thread. The sheriff turned it over in his hand, frowning. "Yours?" Vane snatched it. "No, hers." He stared at it for a long time, then slipped it into his pocket. "Bring her back," he said, "alive or dead." By mid-afternoon, wanted posters began circulating through Natchez and Port Gibson. Negro woman, mid-20s to 30s. Answers to Mira or Amira. Scar on left wrist. Reward, $500. A fortune in a place where freedom itself was cheaper. Meanwhile, downriver, the skiff slid between cypress roots. Cora guided with practiced ease, the oars dipping silently. Mira kept watch. Her mind was already moving, calculating next steps, next disguises, next names. "How far to St. Francisville?" she asked. Cora squinted toward the horizon. "Half a day if the current's kind. You got people waiting there?" "I have debts to collect," Mira said. Cora didn't ask what kind. When the sun reached its highest point, they passed a floating barge carrying cotton bales bound for New Orleans. Mira ducked her head, pulling her shawl low. On the deck, two white men laughed, one of them holding a copy of the Natchez Weekly Courier. Mira caught a glimpse of her own face sketched beneath the headline, "Slave Woman Destroys Belchane Estate, Fugitive at Large." Her chest tightened. Fame, she realized, was just another kind of prison. By late afternoon, they reached the St. Francisville dock. The town smelled of pine tar, whiskey, and river silt. Mira stepped onto dry land, dressed in a borrowed shawl and coarse bonnet, the papers hidden beneath her clothes. The clerk at the ferry office barely looked up. "Evening, ma'am. You headed north?" "Yes," she said, steady. "Memphis." He scribbled something, handed her a ticket, and waved her along. She didn't breathe until she was back among the crowd. Field hands, peddlers, travelers. Just one more face moving through the heat. But Vane's shadow wasn't far behind. By sundown, the sheriff's riders had reached the same dock. One questioned the ferry clerk. "You seen a light-skinned woman about so tall? Might have been traveling alone?" The clerk frowned. "Plenty of women travel alone. Why?" "She's a thief. Burned her master's place." The clerk spat tobacco into the river. "Then maybe she had her reasons." The deputy's jaw tightened. "That an answer? That's all you're getting." The riders left without another word, but the message lingered. For the first time, someone outside Belchane had refused to help. Silence is a form of rebellion. Farther north, Mira boarded the steamer Magnolia Queen. The deck boards creaked beneath her bare feet, and the night air tasted of coal smoke and honeysuckle. Families huddled near the railing. Gamblers laughed over cards. And somewhere below deck, a piano tinkled an off-key hymn. She found a seat near the stern beside a woman sewing by lantern light. The woman glanced up and smiled faintly. "Travelin' far?" "Far enough," Mira replied. The woman nodded. "Sometimes that's the only way." Halfway through the night, the sound of dogs reached the riverbanks, faint but unmistakable. Mira stiffened. The hounds had found her scent again. Cora met her below deck, eyes wide. "They're riding the levee. If they board this boat, you're done." Mira looked toward the shore, saw torches flickering between the trees. She made her choice quickly. "Then I don't wait for them." Cora grabbed her arm. "You can't swim that current." "I don't need to swim," Mira said. "I need to disappear." She slipped her shawl from her shoulders, wrapped it around a bundle of driftwood, and let it drift into the dark water. Within minutes, the torches on shore veered toward it, shouts echoing over the river. The dogs barked wild, fooled by the scent. Mira exhaled. "They'll follow that downstream." Cora grinned. "You got the devil's own wit." But even devils need luck, and luck runs thin on borrowed time. By dawn, the Magnolia Queen docked in Baton Rouge. Mira stepped off with a new name, Mary Cole, borrowed from the sheriff who hunted her. Her plan was simple: sell the stolen deeds before anyone could connect them to Belle Shan. She found a notary's office above a cobbler's shop on Laurel Street, the smell of leather and ink heavy in the air. The clerk, a weary man with ink-stained fingers, skimmed the documents. "Land transfers from Alistair Vane," he muttered. "That old fool finally selling?" She forced a polite smile. "You could say that." He stamped the seal without hesitation. The papers were now legitimate in the eyes of the law. She left the office with a small satchel of money, silver coins, banknotes, and the unmistakable weight of power reclaimed. For the first time, she allowed herself to breathe, but freedom, she knew, was fragile as paper. That same day, a steamboat pilot upriver spotted something floating near the banks, a burned locket engraved with a single initial, M. The report reached Natchez by morning. Sheriff Cole handed the item to Vane. "She's alive," Vane whispered. His eyes gleamed with something between hate and awe. "Alive and clever." Cole leaned forward. "You want her captured, or you want her broken?" "Both." That night, posters doubled the reward. Slave catchers from as far as Tennessee began to ride south. One of them, a lean man named Briggs, was said to track a scent across stone. He was coming. And while Mira moved north under borrowed names and false papers, the hunt was tightening like a noose. Somewhere, she could almost feel it. A shadow gaining on her, step for step. Because Alistair Vane wasn't just hunting a runaway. He was hunting his own humiliation. And humiliation is the cruelest master of all. The first thing people noticed about the bounty posters wasn't the words. It was the number. $1,000 for one woman. Because greed hunts harder than justice ever will. By August 22nd, 1842, Mira's face had reached every post office and tavern from Natchez to Memphis. Her description traveled faster than she could. A light-skinned woman with sharp eyes and a scar on her wrist. But no one mentioned her mind. They never do. In Baton Rouge, she rented a narrow room above a dressmaker's shop that smelled of starch and rosewater. Through the thin floorboards, she could hear the hum of sewing machines, the rhythmic snip of scissors, and the shop girl downstairs humming an old hymn about deliverance. The sound steadied her hands while she spread out her remaining documents across the bed. 3 forged deeds left. Enough to build a new life if she sold them carefully. Enough to buy passage north. Outside, a church bell tolled 8 times. She opened a small Bible hollowed in the center to hide her silver coins, and whispered the same line each night before she slept. Knowledge is the only freedom that can't be chained. Freedom hums in the dark. Across the river, the sheriff's men weren't sleeping. Briggs, the lean tracker, with the sunken eyes, had joined the hunt. He studied the bounty poster under a lantern glow, then looked up at Vane. "She's clever," he said. "Doesn't run straight. She doubles back, crosses water, knows the law better than most lawyers." Vane's jaw tightened. "Then you'll need to think like her." Briggs smirked. "I already do." He'd once hunted escaped convicts through Louisiana swamps, said he could read a person's choices by the way the mud clung to their boots. By midnight, he had the trail. Faint prints in river silt, a broken reed, a single thread caught on cypress bark. "She's heading north by way of the trade road," he muttered. "We'll catch her before week's end." Vane nodded, silent. He wasn't sleeping much either. In his pocket, he still carried the silver locket he'd found in the ruins. Sometimes he opened it, stared at the curl of hair inside, and muttered, "She thinks she's won." Then quieter. No one outsmarts Alistair Vane. But in Baton Rouge, Mira was already turning his own logic against him. She'd made an ally in the dressmaker, a Creole widow named Lisette who had once run messages for abolitionists before her husband's death. Lisette saw something familiar in Mira's stillness. "You got the look of a woman who carries secrets," she said one night while hemming a sleeve. "Don't we all?" Mira replied. Lisette chuckled. "Not like yours." She gestured at the papers Mira was pretending were sewing patterns. "Those ain't cloth." Mira hesitated, then said, "They're my way out." Lisette nodded slowly. "Then let me help you get clear." Over the next 2 days, they built a new disguise. A seamstress heading north to sell designs in Memphis. Lisette tailored a dress of plain calico, altered Mira's posture, taught her how to hold pins instead of ledgers. "You walk different when folks think you got a trade," she said. On the morning of August 24th, Mira left Baton Rouge by stagecoach, clutching a satchel that contained her future. The road north smelled of pine and dust, the air thick with cicadas and danger. Halfway to Port Gibson, the coach halted for inspection. Soldiers, or bounty hunters, it was hard to tell, checked every passenger's papers. Mira felt the sweat slide down her back as one man eyed her hands. "You read or write, miss?" "No, sir," she said softly. "I only sew." He grunted and moved on. When the coach rattled forward again, her breath came out shaky but steady. "You fool men with truth more than lies," she whispered to herself. "Truth can hide better than deceit." Back in Natchez, the sheriff received word from a courier. Woman matching her description boarded the Port Gibson line. Briggs read the report, eyes narrowing. "Then she's buying time. Baton Rouge to Memphis is a week's ride. We'll take the river shortcut." He and his men loaded onto a steamboat called the Calhoun, its deck heavy with cotton bales and chained prisoners bound for sale. The smell of tar and sweat hung thick in the heat. Briggs leaned over the railing, watching the brown water churn. "You can't outrun the river," he muttered. But the river, like the truth, belonged to no one. By the time the Calhoun reached Vicksburg, Mira had already passed through, under a different name, with a fresh letter of reference forged in Lisette's careful hand. She was learning quickly. That night, she took lodging in a boarding house run by a stern widow named Mrs. Price. The floors creaked, the wallpaper peeled, and the hall smelled faintly of kerosene and biscuits. From her window, she could see the river gleaming under moonlight. Same river that had swallowed Bel Shan. She wondered if Vane still walked among its ruins, counting losses that no fire could replace. A week later, Briggs reached Vicksburg. The trail had gone cold. "She's vanished," his deputy said. Briggs crouched near the dock, studying footprints in the mud, dozens overlapping except one. Smaller, lighter, the heel angled just so. He followed it toward a pile of discarded fabric, where a single sewing needle gleamed under the sun. "She was here," he muttered, "and she's still heading north." He lifted his head toward the road. "We ride. The chase never rests." Meanwhile, Mira found work at a tailor's in Jackson, sewing uniforms for men who didn't look her in the eye. She kept her head down, her papers hidden in the lining of her bodice. But every time the door creaked open, she flinched, expecting Briggs, or Vane, or the law. The fear sharpened her focus. Each night after closing, she borrowed the owner's ledgers, studying how supply and payment moved, where names repeated, which merchants traveled north. Information was the one currency she trusted. In mid-September, she learned of a trader leaving for Louisville, a man who dealt in delicate transactions, meaning he'd move property no questions asked. She offered him 2 of her deeds in exchange for safe passage upriver. He studied her over his cigar smoke. "You one of those free women passing as fancy help?" "Something like that." He shrugged. "As long as your silver's good." 3 nights later, she was aboard another steamer, the Lexington Belle, heading north again. The decks were crowded, the cabins damp, the hum of the paddle wheels constant as a heartbeat. Mira slept little, her dreams filled with smoke and running water. Back in Natchez, Alistair Vane had grown gaunt, obsessed. He pored over maps by candlelight, tracing rivers like veins. "She thinks she can erase me," he said to Briggs when the tracker returned empty-handed. "But I'll find her, even if it kills me." Briggs stared at the old man's trembling hands. "Maybe it already is." The lawmen exchanged uneasy glances. Even the sheriff began to distance himself. "She burned your house," he said. "Maybe you let the river keep her." But pride doesn't bury itself. Vane rose to his feet, voice shaking with rage. "You think I'll die remembered as the fool who lost to a slave? I'll chase her to the ends of the earth." That night, thunder rolled again over the ruins of Bel Shan. The ashes stirred, and the wind carried a single scrap of paper from the debris, half a burned ledger page. Mira's handwriting faint but legible. "Property is a matter of belief." By dawn, it had blown east, toward the river, because ghosts don't rest until history remembers their names. And before autumn's end, Mira's name would reach the northern papers, not as fugitive, but as phantom. The Phantom of Bel Shan. The story should have ended with the ashes, but some debts don't burn, they compound, because power hates nothing more than a woman it can't erase. By late September 1842, whispers of the Phantom of Bel Shan drifted along the Mississippi like smoke that refused to die. Riverboat men swore they'd seen her reflection on moonlit water. Tavern talk claimed she'd poisoned her master's fortune and vanished into thin air. But the truth was both simpler and stranger. Mira was alive and working behind the counter of a tailor's shop in Louisville, Kentucky. The shop smelled of lamp oil and wet wool, the hiss of irons mixing with the clack of scissors. Outside, autumn leaves scraped along the cobblestones, orange and brittle as old parchment. She kept to herself, a quiet seamstress with a soft voice and perfect stitches. Her employer, Mr. Caldwell, thought her widowed, polite, God-fearing, which was true in a way. She had buried a life. At night, she counted her coins, a few dollars here, a few there. Freedom came slow, but steady. In a hidden pocket sewn into her hem, she carried her last forged deed, the title to a cotton parcel north of Baton Rouge, still legally hers on paper. She planned to sell it to a broker traveling to Chicago. One sale, she told herself, and I can buy a name that no one questions. But the past moves faster than paperwork, because downriver, Sheriff Cole had been replaced by a federal marshal, a man with fewer scruples and more ambition. His orders were simple: recover the stolen deeds, dead or alive. The new bounty, $1,500, enough to make poor men dangerous. Marshal Briggs, now wearing the badge he'd once mocked, accepted the task with a thin smile. "You can't kill what you can't catch," he muttered, "but you can flush it out." He began in Baton Rouge, questioning merchants, dressmakers, and ferrymen. One remembered a woman named Mary Cole. "Had hands like a scribe," he said. "Spoke careful, like every word had a weight to it." Briggs smiled. Careful words leave careless traces. He followed the trail north again, into Kentucky. The hunt was breathing down her neck. Meanwhile, Mira's life in Louisville was becoming a delicate performance. She sang hymns on Sundays, helped neighbors patch quilts, and joined a small congregation of free blacks who gathered in a tobacco warehouse to teach each other letters after dark. The air smelled of chalk and damp earth. One night, while she was tracing a verse from Exodus, "Let my people go," a man in a gray coat appeared at the door. He claimed to be a traveling preacher, but his boots were too new and his accent too southern. He smiled too easily. "You have a gift for letters, sister," he said. "Where'd you learn to write so fine?" Mira's hand paused mid-stroke. "From a kind woman," she said. "Long time ago." He nodded. "Ain't many kind women down Natchez way, not lately. Seems the devil took one up himself. Clever thing. They say she burned her master's house clean to the ground." The room went silent. The man's eyes glinted. "You ever hear that tale?" Mira met his gaze, heartbeat steady. "I've heard many tales, Reverend. Most told by men who mistook justice for sin." He studied her for a long second, then tipped his hat. "Amen to that," he said, and left. But her hands were still trembling when she set down the chalk. Freedom hums like fear with better rhythm. 2 nights later, a note slipped under her door. "He's coming. Leave by dawn. L. Lisette." Somehow, word had reached her old ally in Baton Rouge. Mira burned the paper in the stove, packed her satchel, and waited for the first light of morning. Louisville woke to fog and distant church bells. The river smelled of coal smoke and frost. She boarded a freight barge disguised as a washerwoman, her papers sewn into a bundle of linens. The captain barely looked at her, another poor soul chasing wages upriver. By the time Briggs arrived in Louisville, the trail was cold again. "She's smoke," he hissed. But he didn't give up. He visited every tailor and ferrymaster showing the poster, repeating the same words. "You seen her?" Most shrugged, some lied, and one, a ferryman near the Indiana border, said, "Woman like that crossed yesterday. Quiet sort, paid in silver, headed north." Briggs tipped his hat. "Then she's out of reach of Southern law," he said. The ferryman spat in the dirt. "Law's just water with a badge, mister. It flows where the powerful want it to." Briggs stared at the river. "And I know how to swim." He followed. By early October, Mira reached Cincinnati. The city smelled of coal, bread, and something new: possibility. She found refuge in a boarding house run by Quakers who asked no questions. They gave her tea, clean sheets, and a name for the first time that wasn't borrowed. "Grace," said Mrs. Harper, the matron. "You look like a Grace." She smiled faintly. "Grace will do." The boarding house was filled with people halfway between slavery and freedom. Runaway mothers, wounded, soldiers, fugitives hiding in plain sight. At night, she taught children their letters by candlelight, using scraps of newspaper. One evening, a man brought news from the South. "That woman, the one who burned her master's house. They say she's haunting the river now. Every time the fog rises, someone claims to see her." Mira smiled into her tea. Ghosts have their uses, but ghosts too can be hunted. Briggs arrived in Cincinnati 10 days later, dressed as a tradesman, carrying a ledger full of names. He asked around politely at first, then not so politely. When that failed, he waited. At dusk, he found his sign, a tailor's scrap stamped with Belshane Cotton Company. The brand was faint, but it was real. "She's here," he whispered. That night, as rain whispered against the window panes, Mira sat at her desk writing a letter she'd never send. "To Alistair Vane, you once wagered I could never outwit you. You were right about one thing. This was never about winning. It was about proving that what you own can rise against you and live. If history remembers you, let it also remember me." She folded the paper, slipped it between the pages of her Bible. At that same hour, Briggs stood outside in the rain, watching the glow of her lamp through the glass. He raised his hand to knock and hesitated. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way her shadow moved. Calm, deliberate, not like a criminal hiding, but like someone who'd already made peace with every outcome. He lowered his hand. When he returned to the tavern, the barkeep asked, "You find her?" Briggs stared into his drink. "Maybe." The man laughed. "Then where's your bounty?" Briggs looked out at the rain. "You ever think some folks ain't meant to be caught?" Outside, the river rolled on, carrying secrets toward the north, and by dawn, the boarding house room was empty. On the desk lay a single line written in Mira's hand. "Freedom is the debt the living owe the dead." She'd gone again, vanishing into the fog like a name erased from a ledger. The phantom moved north, but her story was no longer hers alone. In Cincinnati's streets, people whispered about the woman who stole her master's fortune and vanished with the river. Mothers told it to their daughters at night, a caution or a prayer, depending on who was listening. And somewhere upriver, a new rumor began to spread. Of a light-skinned woman teaching letters under a false name, saving for a schoolhouse she planned to open when ghosts could walk free. Because even a ghost can plant a seed. And that seed was already growing into something larger, an idea no flame could consume. The school began with 1 table, 2 benches, and 3 children. By winter's end, it had become a beacon. Because knowledge spreads like fire. But this time, it healed instead of burned. Cincinnati, late winter of 1843. The river lay half frozen, its gray surface veined with ice. The city smelled of coal smoke and thawing mud. In a narrow alley off Walnut Street, a plain clapboard house stood, its windows glowing with lamplight. Inside, Mira, now Grace, taught by candlelight. The air carried the scent of chalk dust and ink. The texture of rough wool coats brushed her arm as children leaned close to copy letters on slate. She guided their hands gently. "Freedom," she said, tracing each letter. "It begins here, In your mind. A boy raised his hand. Miss Grace, is it true you come from down south? She paused. Yes. Did you see the big houses? I saw one burn, she said softly. The children fell silent. The firelight flickered over their faces. Mira let the silence linger. Lessons she had learned, sometimes lived between words. Some fires purify instead of destroy. By spring, rumors about the school began to spread. Some called it the Colored Seminary, others the Ghost's Classroom. The name made her smile, but it also brought attention, both wanted and dangerous. The local abolitionist circle offered funds. The city constable offered threats. Teaching slaves' children letters, he said, is one step from rebellion. Mira replied, Then I suppose I've been rebelling my whole life. She taught anyway. Meanwhile, far to the south, Belshane was no more than a scar on the landscape. The ashes had hardened into black glass where the great hall once stood. Alistair Vane's creditors had stripped the land, the title disputes unsolved. Locals said the ground there refused to grow cotton anymore. They whispered it was cursed, haunted by a woman who'd written her freedom in flames. Vane himself had vanished. Some claimed he'd sailed to Europe, others that he'd drowned chasing phantoms along the river. But his obsession had taken root in other men. Marshall Briggs, now gray around the temples, still carried her old wanted poster, creased and faded. He'd been demoted, then reassigned to Kentucky, where he spent his evenings drinking cheap whiskey and staring at the river. You still think she's out there? A barkeep asked one night. Briggs nodded. Not as a fugitive, as an idea. You can't catch that. But ideas, like ghosts, leave traces. One of the Quaker sponsors of Mira's school, Mrs. Harper, had been corresponding with abolitionist networks. She kept records, neatly dated, detailing Miss Grace's work. One entry read, March 3rd, 1843. Enrollment, 9 pupils. Curriculum, reading, scripture, and letters of self-worth. Remark, she carries a quiet authority. There's sorrow beneath it, but also something like peace. Those papers would survive decades later, long after the names were forgotten. Yet danger had not vanished. It had only changed uniforms. Slave catchers still roamed the borders, armed with the fugitive slave law and the weight of Southern gold. And someone, perhaps a survivor of Vane's old circle, had sent word north. She's alive. She calls herself Grace. In May, a stranger arrived at the school. He wore a preacher's collar and carried a Bible under one arm. Mira recognized the rhythm of his stride before he even spoke. Briggs. He looked older, softer around the eyes. He removed his hat. You teach children now? Mira didn't answer. The student sat frozen. I came to see if the ghost was real, he said quietly. Now I see she's flesh and blood after all. She nodded toward the door. If you mean harm, leave. If you mean truth, sit. He hesitated, then took a seat on the bench, the same one her smallest student had carved initials into. I'm not here for the bounty, he said. That died with your master. He wasn't my master. Briggs gave a humorless smile. No, maybe no one ever was. He opened his Bible, but inside was her old wanted poster, folded between Psalms and Proverbs. You know what this says? He asked. Reward for the capture of one enslaved woman, fugitive and arsonist. I used to think those words meant justice. He looked up at her. Now they just look like a lie. Mira studied him for a long time. Then why keep it? Because it reminds me who the villain really was. Outside, rain began to patter against the roof. The children whispered, watching the two adults like actors in a strange play. "Go on home," Mira told them gently. "Lessons are done for today." When the last child left, she faced Briggs again. "Why are you truly here?" He sighed. "To tell you Vane's dead. Drowned, they say. His estate, what's left of it, was sold at auction. The court cleared your name, though they don't know it's yours." Mira exhaled slowly, the sound halfway between grief and release. "Then that part of me is gone," she said. Briggs rose, pulling on his hat. "You could start fresh now. You already have." She smiled faintly. "I started fresh the night I struck the match." He paused at the door. "You burned more than a house, you know." "I hope so," she said. Justice smolders long after the flames die. Weeks passed. Briggs didn't return. Word spread that he'd moved west. Mira kept teaching. The school grew. By midsummer, 20 students filled the room, their voices echoing down the street. One humid evening, as thunder rolled over the river, Lisette arrived from Baton Rouge. Her hair had turned silver, her hands rough from years of work. She hugged Mira tight. "They say you're building a real school," she said. "I'm building a promise," Mira replied. Lisette laughed through tears. "Girl, you always did gamble higher than the men who tried to own you." They spent the night talking, remembering the smokehouse, the plan, the fire. Lisette shook her head. "You ever regret it?" Mira looked out the window at the children's slates stacked neatly on the sill. "Every time I breathe in peace, I remember the price, but I wouldn't trade it." That fall, the school received its first donation from a Northern abolitionist society, $50 and a crate of new readers. On the inside cover of one was written in careful penmanship, "To Miss Grace, whose courage teaches beyond letters." But peace is never a permanent guest. Late one October evening, she found a letter nailed to the door. "We know who you are." No signature, only a smear of tar shaped like a handprint. Mira read it, then burned it in the stove. The smell of charred paper filled the room, eerily familiar. Lisette urged her to flee again. "You could head to Canada, safe up there." Mira shook her head. "If I run again, I stay a fugitive forever. But if I stand still, I become a story they can't kill." She stayed. The threats came and went. A rock through the window, paint on the door. But the students kept coming, and the lessons continued. Years later, when one of her oldest pupils asked her why she never left, she said, "Because the river carried my fear away long ago." The past can chase, but it can't command. By 1847, the school had doubled in size. Travelers from as far as Pennsylvania visited to see the colored woman who taught the unteachable. Some called her reckless. Others called her holy. And somewhere in Louisiana, the locals still swore that when the wind blew across the burned fields of Belle Chaine, you could smell the faint trace of smoke and lilacs, the ghost of a woman who outsmarted her master and lit a fire no rain could quench. Because the mind, once set alight, never returns to darkness. But Mira's legend was only beginning to grow teeth, because power never forgets humiliation, and one final reckoning was about to rise from the river. The river had always carried her story forward. Now it was bringing something back, because history never forgives what it cannot explain. Cincinnati, summer of 1848. The air shimmered with heat and coal soot. The river ran low and sluggish, the banks cracked like old parchment. Mira stood at the window of her schoolhouse, chalk in hand, when she saw the first sign. A steamboat docked at the levee flying a faded red pennant, the mark of Southern trade. Men unloaded crates, barrels, and one trunk with iron corners. On its lid, stenciled faintly, was a name she thought she'd buried. A. Vane Estate. Her stomach turned. "Miss Grace?" one of the children asked. "You all right?" She smiled faintly. "Go on reading, Caleb. I'll be right back." Outside, sunlight burned off the last morning haze. Mira walked to the riverfront, each step measured, heart thrumming like a drum. The men hauling freight barely noticed her. The trunk sat in the shade of a cotton bale, lock gleaming in the light. She knelt, brushed away dust, and read the shipping tag. Property of the late Alistair Vane, recovered from Natchez archives. Delivery, Cincinnati. Probate office. The past had floated north in a box. She walked away quickly, but her hands trembled. For years she had built a life of calm, of study, of teaching. Yet the weight of that name, the man, the cruelty, the wager, was enough to crack the peace she'd forged. That evening, after dismissing the children, she walked down to the probate building, a red brick structure smelling of old paper and damp leather. Inside, a clerk with spectacles perched on his nose was cataloging the trunk's contents. Ledgers, letters, a few personal effects. "Miss?" he said, noticing her at the door. "Looking for someone?" "I heard there were records from the Vane estate," she said evenly. He nodded toward the pile. "Tragic story, that one. Planter loses everything, drowns himself in the river. His family wants whatever scraps remain sent north for auction. Most of it's worthless. Mind if I look?" "Records are public," he said, shrugging. She opened the ledger carefully. The ink had faded, but she recognized every loop of the handwriting, her own forged years ago. Her breath caught. Inside was proof of everything. The land deeds, the fake transfers, even the coded notes she'd used to deceive his lawyers. She closed the book softly. "Ma'am," the clerk said. "You all right?" "Yes," she replied, voice calm again. "Just ghosts on paper." Ghosts weigh more than bodies. That night she couldn't sleep. The past she'd buried was being exhumed by strangers. She feared what might follow, the law, the lies, or perhaps the memory of the man himself. Because part of her had never believed Alistair Vane was truly dead. And she was right. 2 weeks later, a steamer from New Orleans brought a new passenger upriver, a gaunt man in a black coat, left arm wrapped in a sling. His ticket bore a false name, but the scars on his hands told another story. Vane had survived. He'd spent years hiding under assumed identities, surviving on credit and hatred. The newspapers had called him drowned. He'd called himself reborn. Now, with his fortune gone and his body failing, he had come north chasing one last ghost. "Mira," he whispered as the boat docked under a red sunset. "Let's finish the wager." He took lodging in a cheap riverside inn, coughing blood into a handkerchief. At night, he wandered the levee, asking about a woman named Grace who ran a colored school. The locals shrugged him off. One finally said, "You talking about the ghost teacher? She's up on Walnut Street." Vane smiled, teeth yellow as parchment. Perfect. The next morning, Mira woke to find a letter slipped under the schoolhouse door. The handwriting was unmistakable, tight, arrogant, deliberate. "To the cleverest liar I ever owned, you burned my house. You stole my name. But every debt circles back, and this river still runs both ways. Meet me where the ashes began." No signature. Just a pressed magnolia petal, browned with age. Her first instinct was to burn it. Her second was to hide. But something colder, older, rose inside her. Curiosity. That night, she packed her satchel, left Lisette a note, "Don't follow," and boarded a freight barge heading south. The air smelled of tar and thunder. She watched the city lights fade until they were only pinpricks swallowed by the river. You can't bury what was never dead. 3 days later, the barge docked near the ruins of Bel Shan. The land was half swallowed by swamp now. Weeds grew through the blackened foundations. The air buzzed with insects, heavy and still. Vane was waiting by the shell of the old veranda, leaning on a cane. His face was gaunt, eyes fever-bright. "You look like a ghost," she said. He smiled faintly. "I could say the same." They stood in silence a long moment, cicadas screaming overhead. "I came to see if the land remembered," she said. "It remembers everything," he rasped. "The fire, the theft, you. Then it remembers who lit the match." He laughed, a dry, broken sound. "You think you won? Look around you, nothing grows here. You cursed it and yourself." "I freed it." "From what? Me?" "You can't free yourself from blood." He coughed hard, spat red into the dirt. "You carry me in you. Every word you write, every lesson you teach. It all began in my house." Mira stepped closer, her voice low. "Then maybe the house taught the wrong lesson." He studied her face, the years etched around her eyes. "You should have left me to drown. I tried." Vane straightened, pain flickering across his features. "The laws caught up to you, you know. Those deeds, those forgeries, they're being reopened. If I die tonight, you'll hang by spring." Mira's eyes did not waver. "Then we die on the same ground." He blinked, unsure if she was bluffing. Lightning cracked above the swamp, and rain began to fall, soft, steady, cleansing. She turned toward the ruins of the main hall. In its center, half buried under vines, stood the old safe. She knelt, pried it open with a rusted rod. Inside lay the last remnants of Vane's empire. Coins fused by fire, a signet ring, a sealed envelope. She held the envelope out to him. "Your wager." He snatched it open. Inside was the same piece of paper he'd once made her sign, a contract of servitude. But across it, in neat ink, were 6 words. "I outlived your ownership. I win." He stared at it, trembling. "You—" But before he could finish, his legs gave way. He crumpled onto the blackened earth, clutching his chest. Mira knelt beside him, the rain plastering her hair to her face. "Rest," she said. "You've chased your ghost far enough." He looked up at her, eyes glassy. "Was any of it worth it?" She didn't answer. Moments later, Alistair Vane exhaled his last breath, and the rain washed the dust from his face. Mira sat there until dawn. The swamp steamed. A heron flew overhead. The fire's scar smelled faintly of wet ash and memory. When she finally stood, she took the burned signet ring and tossed it into the water. It sank with a soft plop, swallowed whole by the river that had carried both their fates. The wager was over. By the time she returned to Cincinnati weeks later, no one spoke of Vane anymore. His estate was gone, his name forgotten except in whispers. But the legend, the Phantom of Bel Shan, had changed shape again. Now people said she didn't haunt the South at all. She haunted the powerful, the ones who thought their names eternal. In the quiet of her classroom, Mira hung a single framed sentence above the blackboard, written in her careful hand. "Every empire ends where its cruelty begins." When students asked what it meant, she only smiled. Some lessons are earned in fire. Outside, the river rolled on, brown, ancient, endless. It carried silt and secrets alike, erasing and revealing in equal measure. And though she never spoke his name again, some nights, when thunder crawled over the horizon, Mira would step outside and whisper to the dark, "You lost the bet, Alistair. The story's mine now." Because ghosts don't vanish, they inherit the earth. The story did not die with its teller. It took root in the silence she left behind. Because when truth burns, rumor becomes its smoke. By the spring of 1852, Mira's name had faded from records, but not from mouths. In the neighborhoods around Walnut Street, where her small riverfront school once stood, people told stories at dusk, stories that changed with every telling. Some said she had married a preacher and gone west. Others swore she'd vanished again, walking into the fog one morning with nothing but her Bible. But the children she taught never forgot. They grew up and told their own children about Miss Grace, the woman who said words were weapons sharper than any blade, about how she had once faced a man who owned everything and took it from him with ink, wit, and flame, about how she wrote her freedom into existence. In a box beneath the schoolhouse floor, one of her students, now grown, found her letters after a flood receded. The papers were damp but readable. April 9th, 1849. The mind is a strange kind of battlefield. You fight your master's voice until it becomes your own, and then you must learn to silence it without killing yourself in the process. June 21st, 1849. If they call me a phantom, let it be because I move without their permission. The discovery caused a stir among abolitionist circles. Pamphlets reprinted her words anonymously as letters from the phantom teacher. Each sentence carried the gravity of lived defiance. One line became a rallying cry. Freedom is not granted, it is reclaimed. By 1855, that phrase appeared in speeches from Boston to Philadelphia, credited only to an unknown woman of the river. Ghosts become powerful when they can't be punished. Meanwhile, down in Louisiana, the land that had once been Belle Chene remained stubbornly barren. Travelers said nothing grew there except wildflowers and rumor. Some nights, they claimed, you could see a lantern moving among the ruins, hear pages turning in the dark. One overseer swore he saw a figure kneeling by the old safe, her hands black with soot, whispering words that made the wind rise. "Must have been a trick of light," he said afterward. But he never went near the place again. The locals called it the widow's ground. No one dared plow it. No one claimed the deeds. In truth, Mira had never returned. But her presence, her defiance, hung over that soil like a fog that refused to lift. Years later, after the war, Union soldiers stumbled across Belle Chene's ruins. Among the rubble, they found a brass nameplate half buried in clay. The engraving was almost gone, but two words remained clear: Belle Chene. Beneath it, scratched in smaller letters by some unknown hand, property of none. It was placed in a museum in Baton Rouge, labeled simply Artifact of Unknown Origin. Visitors passed it every day without knowing the story behind it. But stories have ways of resurrecting themselves when the world is ready. In the 1870s, a journalist named Caleb Hearst, a freedman educated in Cincinnati, began researching the old Southern estates destroyed before emancipation. He found an entry in a Louisiana probate ledger referencing a missing bondswoman named Mira. The entry noted, "Subject vanished following total loss of property. Fate unknown." Caleb recognized the name. He had once been a boy in her classroom, so he traveled south. He followed the river to the blackened fields, the cypress swamps, the cracked foundations. He walked the same paths she had once taken, the same banks where the ashes had fallen. In his journal, he wrote, December 24th, 1871. There is no house here, only the outline of memory. Yet the ground hums with something I cannot name. It is as if knowledge itself has taken root where cruelty once stood. He interviewed locals. One woman, old and toothless, told him, "That land remembers. The night she burned it, even the frogs went silent. But she didn't do it for hate. She did it for truth." Caleb asked, "How do you know?" The woman smiled. "'Cause the air felt clean when it was done." When Caleb returned north, he published a piece in the Tribune titled, "The Phantom Who Freed Herself." It told the story as best he could verify it. Half fact, half myth, entirely magnetic. The article ended with a line that echoed across generations. Her chains turned to ink, and her revenge was education. Readers were spellbound. Churches read it aloud during Sunday services. Women's societies quoted it as parable. Teachers named their schools Bel Shen Seminary for Colored Youth, believing it a tribute to the spirit who had burned down one kind of knowledge to build another. But even as the legend grew, questions lingered. Where had Mira gone after her final encounter with Vane? Had she truly walked back into the river as some claimed? Or had she simply lived out her days quietly under another name, watching her students become free people in a country still learning what that word meant? No one could say. One theory suggested she joined the Underground Railroad, using her skill with papers and maps to move fugitives north. Another insisted she had gone west under the name Marion Jones, teaching in a settlement school in Kansas. There were even whispers that she had met Frederick Douglass himself, though none could prove it. What mattered was that the name Mira had transcended the woman. In time, it became shorthand in abolitionist literature. The Mira question, the moral debate of whether rebellion through deception was justified in the face of tyranny. Scholars argued her ethics. Poets romanticized her defiance. Preachers turned her fire into sermon. But her students remembered her differently. They remembered the sound of chalk on slate, the smell of river air through open windows, the way she paused before speaking, as if measuring the weight of every word before setting it free. One of them, Sarah Harper, later wrote in her memoir, "She never told us her story plain. She let us build it from pieces. But when I asked her once if she believed in God, she said, 'I believe in justice, and if He's real, He believes in it too.' Justice hums under every silence. In the end, the legend of Bel Shen did what no empire could. It endured." By the turn of the century, Southern writers spoke of the phantom's curse, a superstition that every plantation built on cruelty would one day be reclaimed by nature. Northern reformers reframed it as a prophecy of liberation. The truth, of course, lay somewhere between the two. A single woman's defiance rewritten into collective memory. And so the story circled back to where it began. On the banks of a river that never stops moving, carrying secrets downstream until they become history. On quiet nights, fishermen still swear that when the mist rolls low over the Mississippi, a lantern light flickers along the water, followed by the faint scent of lilac and smoke. Some say it's the phantom of Bel Shen guarding the river's lost souls. Others, those who know better, say it's the spirit of a teacher watching over every child who learns to read. Because knowledge was her fire, and she never let it die. And to this day, a single weather-worn stone stands in the weeds near the old plantation grounds. It bears no name, only a carved inscription, faint but legible if you kneel close enough to read it. She bet on her mind, and won. The wager ended long ago, but the lesson still burns. Some locals still whisper that when storms roll over the river, lightning strikes that same patch of earth first, as if the heavens themselves remember what happened there. They call it divine justice. They call it coincidence. But in Louisiana's humid nights, when thunder crawls low and the magnolias bloom too early, it's said the ground exhales a breath of smoke, and the faint echo of a woman's voice can be heard, steady, unbroken, defiant. I am still free. Because every story that begins in chains deserves to end in fire. Legend tag. They say the ashes of Belchen still glow beneath the soil, and when the moon is low, farmers swear the earth there warms to the touch, as if someone below is still holding a flame. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.